the secret deal that ignited 100 years of war. Intro. For more than 100 years, the Middle East has seemed like a tinderbox of conflict and endless instability. We all see the headlines and witness the devastation, but how often do we ask the most basic question: who lit the fuse in the first place? From the brutal civil wars in Syria and Iraq to the intractable conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, the roots of so much of this turmoil don't just trace back to ancient hatreds, but to very modern betrayals. What if I told you the map of today's Middle East wasn't drawn by its own people, but was drawn for them, by distant empires looking out for their own selfish interests? Hook. What if the match that lit this century of fire was a secret deal? A cynical pact between two old rivals who, while publicly talking about freedom, were privately plotting to dominate the world. This is the story of that deal. It's the story of how a single line, crudely drawn in the sand by a British and a French diplomat, shattered the promise of Arab independence and laid the groundwork for 100 years of bloodshed. This is the story of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Section 1: The World at War, a Crumbling Empire. Our story starts not in the Arabian desert, but in the mud-soaked trenches and smoke-filled war rooms of World War I. By 1915, the war had swallowed Europe, and its shockwaves were being felt across the globe. At the center of this storm was a sprawling, ancient, and very sick power, the Ottoman Empire. For 600 years, it had ruled a vast territory from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula. But by the 20th century, the empire was in terminal decline, famously nicknamed the sick man of Europe. So when the Ottomans made the fateful call to ally with Germany, the great powers of Britain, France, and Russia saw their chance. The collapse of their old rival was no longer a question of if, but when. And with that collapse would come the biggest territorial prize of the modern era, the Middle East. For the British Empire, the stakes were huge. Their global power depended on the Royal Navy and the sea lanes it controlled, especially the Suez Canal in Egypt, the imperial lifeline to India, the jewel in Britain's crown. But another incentive was quickly emerging: oil. The British Navy was switching its fleet from coal to oil, so securing a reliable source of petroleum wasn't just an advantage, it was a matter of survival. And Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, was rumored to be sitting on vast, untapped reserves. France had its own deep-rooted ambitions in the region, with centuries of economic and cultural ties to the Levant, particularly modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Paris saw itself as the rightful protector of the Christian communities there and was determined to get its slice of the pie. Meanwhile, Imperial Russia, the third member of the Entente, had its own ancient dream: to control the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, and the Turkish Straits, which would give its navy year-round access to the Mediterranean. But there was another force stirring in the deserts: the dawn of Arab nationalism. After centuries under Ottoman rule, a growing movement of Arab leaders wanted to cast off the yoke of Istanbul and forge their own independent destiny. At the heart of this was Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Emir of Mecca. As a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and guardian of Islam's holiest cities, he held a unique authority. Hussein saw the Great War as his golden opportunity. An alliance with the British could give him the guns and gold he needed to launch a great Arab revolt. In turn, the British saw Hussein as the perfect proxy. An Arab rebellion would tie down hundreds of thousands of Ottoman troops and, by aligning with the Sharif of Mecca, Britain could counteract the Ottoman Sultan's call for a global jihad, or holy war, against the Allies, a call that made London very nervous. The stage was set for a grand bargain. It would be an alliance built on a promise of freedom, a promise that would echo through the decades not as a symbol of liberation, but of profound betrayal. Section 2: The Double Promise, a Game of Deceit. In the shadowy world of wartime diplomacy, promises are currency. Between 1915 and 1916, a series of 10 letters traveled between Sharif Hussein in Mecca and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt. This exchange, known as the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, was the first of Britain's contradictory pledges. Hussein laid out his terms: in exchange for rising up against the Ottomans, he demanded British support for the independence of all Arab lands, a vast territory from modern-day Turkey down through Syria and the Arabian Peninsula. McMahon's job was to get Hussein on board, and fast. The Allied campaign at Gallipoli was a disaster, and they desperately needed a new front. In a key letter dated October 24, 1915, McMahon gave Hussein the assurance he wanted. He declared that Great Britain was prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs in all the regions within the limits demanded by the Sharif of Mecca. For the first time, a world power seemed to be backing the creation of a massive, independent Arab state. Taking this as a solemn promise, Hussein began preparing for war. But the devil was in the details. McMahon included a fatefully ambiguous reservation. Britain, he wrote, could not pledge territory where it wasn't free to act without detriment to the interests of her ally, France, specifically excluding portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo. To the Arabs, this seemed to refer only to the coastal areas of modern-day Lebanon. The vast interior, including those key cities, seemed to be firmly inside their future state. Critically, Palestine, which lay southwest of Damascus, wasn't mentioned at all. In Hussein's mind, that meant it was unequivocally part of the future Arab kingdom. Historians have argued for a century whether this was a careless mistake or calculated deceit. Was McMahon just using vague language to close a deal? Or was he creating a loophole? The British government would later argue that Palestine was implicitly part of the west of Damascus exclusion, an interpretation that requires some spectacular mental gymnastics to believe. Either way, the Arabs believed they had been promised a kingdom, including Palestine, and they had a written guarantee from the most powerful empire on earth. They were fighting not just against the Ottomans, but for a future they believed their British allies had sworn to uphold. But this was only one side of a two-faced policy. Even as McMahon was drafting his promises, other British officials were having a very different conversation in secret. It was a conversation not about liberation, but about partition. Britain was simultaneously negotiating with France to secretly carve up the very lands it was promising to Sharif Hussein. Section 3, The Secret Architects, A Line in the Sand. As letters of promise were heading to Mecca, two men were meeting in the quiet corridors of power in London and Paris. Their job was to solve the Eastern question, what to do with the Ottoman Empire's lands when it finally collapsed. Their solution would become one of the most infamous secret treaties in history. Sir Mark Sykes was a restless English aristocrat and a self-proclaimed expert on the Middle East, with an unshakable belief in the British Empire's mission. His counterpart was François-Georges Picot, a professional French diplomat and a fierce defender of French interests, particularly its claim to a Greater Syria. Through late 1915 and early 1916, they negotiated. With a map spread before them, they began to draw lines, dividing up lands they barely knew for people they would never meet. They weren't concerned with the complex tapestry of ethnic and religious groups on the ground, they cared about oil, trade routes, and imperial prestige. The final agreement, secretly ratified in May 1916, was a masterclass in colonial calculus. It painted the map in imperial shades of red and blue. France was given a blue zone of direct control over coastal Syria and Lebanon. It also claimed a sphere of influence over the Syrian interior, including Damascus and Aleppo, the very cities the Arabs thought would be the heart of their new kingdom. Britain got a red zone of direct control over southern Mesopotamia, including Baghdad and Basra, securing the route to the Persian Gulf and its suspected oil fields. Attached to this was Zone B, a British sphere of influence across what is now Jordan and the Iraqi desert. And what about Palestine? Its holy city, Jerusalem, was too sensitive for any one power to control. It was designated a brown zone to be placed under an international administration, to be sorted out later. To keep up appearances, the agreement said that within the French and British spheres of influence, an independent Arab state could exist. But this was a hollow promise. The fine print made it clear that France and Britain would be the sole suppliers of advisors and would have priority on all economic projects. It was independence in name only, a blueprint for colonial puppetry. The motivation was nakedly imperial. For Britain, the deal created a land bridge from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, secured the Suez Canal, and positioned it to control the future of Middle Eastern oil. In a later tweak to the deal, the oil-rich province of Mosul, first promised to the French, was quietly traded to Britain in exchange for a share of the oil revenues. It was a transaction that revealed everyone's true priorities. All of this was done in absolute secrecy. The men fighting and dying in the desert, thinking they were fighting for Arab liberty, were actually pawns in an imperial land grab. Section 4, The Betrayal Revealed. While Sykes and Picot were redrawing the map, Sharif Hussein, true to his word, lit the fires of rebellion. On June 10, 1916, the Great Arab Revolt erupted. Armed with British rifles and gold, Arab forces attacked Ottoman garrisons, captured Mecca, and began a grueling desert campaign north. A key figure in this fight was a charismatic British officer, T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence, an Arabist who served as a liaison to the rebels, developed a deep bond with Hussein's son, Prince Faisal. Together, they waged a guerrilla war, culminating in the legendary capture of the port of Aqaba in 1917. Lawrence and his Arab comrades were fighting under the belief that their sacrifices would be rewarded with the unified Arab nation Britain had promised. They were living a lie. The bombshell dropped in November 1917. But it came not from London or Paris, but from Petrograd, Russia. The Tsar had been overthrown, and the new Bolshevik government, led by Vladimir Lenin, set out to expose what they saw as the predatory, imperialist nature of the war. Ransacking the old Foreign Ministry archives, they found the full text of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Looking to discredit the Allies, the Bolsheviks published the secret treaty for the world to see. The reaction in the Arab world was stunned disbelief, which quickly turned to fury. The men fighting alongside British officers now learned they had been deceived from the start. Their promised kingdom was just a collection of French and British protectorates. The Ottoman commanders, sensing a propaganda victory, gleefully confirmed the details of the pact, dropping leaflets with the treaty's text over the Arab lines. In London, a frantic damage control operation began. British officials tried to reassure a shaken Sharif Hussein, calling the document an outdated plan that had been superseded by their commitment to the Arabs. But the trust was gone. The phrase Sykes-Picot entered the Arab language as the ultimate symbol of Western betrayal, a wound that has never fully healed. Despite the betrayal, the Arab forces had little choice but to keep fighting. The Ottomans were a far worse alternative, and they hoped their victories on the battlefield might still force their allies to honor the original promise. In October 1918, Arab forces, with Prince Faisal at their head, triumphantly entered Damascus. For a fleeting moment, it seemed their dream was still within reach. But the lines drawn by Sykes and Picot were about to be etched into the very soil of the Middle East. Section 5, Carving the Carcass, the Post-War World. When the Great War ended in 1918, the victorious Allies met in Paris and later at San Remo, Italy, to redraw the map of the world. It was here that the secret vision of Sykes and Picot was brought into the light and formalized as international law. Prince Faisal, the hero of the Arab Revolt, went to Paris to plead the Arab case for the independent state he'd been promised. He was mostly ignored. The interests of empire, oil and strategic position drowned out any talk of promises made in the heat of war. The Allies used a new invention to legitimize their takeover, the League of Nations mandate system. It was presented as a benevolent form of teaching. The former Ottoman lands were made Classa mandates, supposedly ready for provisional independence but still needing administrative advice and assistance from a mandatory power. It was colonialism dressed up in the language of self-determination. At the San Remo conference, the final lines were drawn, largely following the Sykes-Picot blueprint. France was officially granted the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain secured the mandates for Palestine and a newly created state called Mesopotamia, soon to be renamed Iraq. There were a few key changes from the secret map. Britain made sure the oil-rich province of Mosul was part of its mandate of Iraq, cementing control over the region's petroleum. In return, France was given a 25% share in the new British-controlled Turkish Petroleum Company. The future of the Middle East was being traded, barrel by barrel. Putting these mandates into practice was brutal. When the Arabs declared an independent kingdom of Syria with Faisal as king, French forces marched on Damascus in 1920, crushed the Syrian army, and sent Faisal into exile. In Iraq, a major revolt against British rule was ruthlessly suppressed by the Royal Air Force, one of the first times aerial bombing was used for colonial policing. As a consolation prize, the British installed two of Sharif Hussein's sons as client kings. Faisal, fresh from being kicked out of Syria, was made king of Iraq. His brother, Abdullah, was made emir of a new entity called Transjordan, carved out of the British mandate for Palestine. They were kings, but their thrones rested on British bayonets. The map of the modern Middle East was taking shape, drawn by men in European capitals. Borders were straight lines that cut across ancient tribal lands, lumping rival groups into newly invented nations and separating communities that had lived together for centuries. This wasn't nation-building, it was the deliberate construction of a fragile system whose internal tensions would ensure the old imperial masters could keep pulling the strings for decades to come. And the British mandate for Palestine was set on a collision course with itself. During the war, Britain had made another, conflicting promise, the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which pledged support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should be protected. The ink was drying on a map of future conflict. Section 6, The Legacy of a Line, a Century of Conflict. The lines drawn by Sykes and Picot were more than just borders, they were political fault lines. The artificial states they helped create were often seen by their own people as legacies of colonial rule, not authentic nations. This has fueled a century of instability. The consequences have been unending. In Iraq, the uneasy mix of Shia Arabs, Sunni Arabs, and Kurds, forced into a single state, bred deep resentments that led to brutal repression and devastating civil wars. In Syria and Lebanon, the French policy of divide and rule pitted communities against each other, leaving a poisonous legacy that contributed to the Lebanese civil war and the Syrian conflict we see today. But nowhere has the legacy of these overlapping betrayals been more catastrophic than in Palestine. The Sykes-Picot plan for an international zone, the promise to the Arabs, and the Balfour Declaration created an unsolvable puzzle. The British Mandate became a battleground between two national movements. The failure to find a just solution led directly to the 1948 war, the creation of the State of Israel, and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, igniting a conflict that remains an open wound in the heart of the region. The Sykes-Picot conspiracy has become a powerful symbol of Western betrayal for generations of Arab leaders. The most dramatic challenge to these borders came recently. When the militant group ISIS bulldozed the border between Iraq and Syria in 2014, they did it under a banner that read, "The End of Sykes-Picot." Their goal was to erase the colonial frontiers and build a new caliphate. While their methods were monstrous, their slogan tapped into a century of genuine grievance against the post-war order. The Secret Pact of 1916 helped set a tragic cycle in motion. Artificial borders created weak states. Weak states empowered authoritarian rulers. Repression fueled extremism. And the resulting chaos has repeatedly invited foreign intervention, from the Cold War to today, as outside powers continue to pursue their own interests in this vital, and perpetually volatile, region. CTA. The story of Sykes-Picot is a powerful reminder of how the past shapes our present. If you want to keep exploring the hidden histories that define our world, please consider subscribing to our channel and joining the conversation. Conclusion. A backroom deal, born from wartime opportunism, left a legacy of division that has defined a region and impacted the entire world. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was the height of imperial arrogance, the belief that powerful nations could decide the fate of the powerless, drawing lines on maps without a thought for the people living within them. It was a deal that replaced one empire with many, but it denied the promise of true freedom. The conflicts we see today in Syria, Iraq, and Palestine aren't just spontaneous eruptions of ancient hatreds. They are the long, violent aftershocks of an earthquake that struck over a century ago, when two men with a pencil decided the fate of millions. The secret they tried to keep became a scar on the face of the world, a line in the sand that has been written, and rewritten, in blood.